Thanks, everyone, for joining us back at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Eugene Puryear, who's an American journalist, author, activist, politician, and host on Breakthrough News. He's also the author of Shackled and Chained: Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America. Eugene, thanks so much for being here.
Eleanor, thank you so much for having me on. It's really an honor to have the opportunity to come back.
The honor is mine. So I wanted to ask you on today to talk about something that I doubt folks are hearing about at the moment: the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has vast stores of coltan, gold, tin, cobalt, copper, zinc, diamonds, and other rare earth minerals, which should be a source of great wealth and stability based on capitalist supply and demand, right? But of course, thanks to imperialism, this is instead a source of great poverty and instability. And since about 1996, as I understand it, Congo has been in the throes of what some have been calling a silent holocaust, killing upwards of 6 million people and involving militia groups from all over the region, many backed directly by the US, France, and the UK. So as to secure access to those minerals. So, Eugene, could you fill out this context a little bit more about what's happening right now in Congo and why it's bubbling up specifically right now in some alternative and social media platforms?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And, this is a perennial issue, and you're 100% correct. Since 1996, Congo has been locked in essentially what you could call a civil war, but it's a multi-sided civil war. And, it flares up, it flares down, but it's been very consistent, since that time. And I think people are pointing to this issue now because it's one of the perennial under-discussed issues. I mean, more people have died, in this war than in many of the large wars we talk about all the time in the context of world history. But of course, most of those wars involve Europe and the United States. So it also speaks to how Africa is often erased. But right now, what we're seeing in Congo is the continuation of a flare up in this long conflict that started about a year ago, roughly. And that is the ongoing offensives by a rebel group that's backed by Rwanda that's known as M23. So to just take one step back for people to understand a little bit, and I thought you gave great framing. There's $24 trillion of wealth in the ground in DRC. So this is a highly, sought after area. And if you control territory in DRC, you can make a lot of money. So for many years, people probably know, especially people maybe who've seen the movie Ali, about Muhammad Ali, the leader was a guy named Mobutu Sese Seko. I won't get into that now, but he falls in 1997. And really, since then, the country has been in this state of, sort of semi-Balkanization, where it's a huge, vast country. I mean, almost all of Western Europe could fit in DRC. And so once the sort of central governing authority, which was, it was one man rule kind of situation, breaks down, you get sort of a free-for-all in Congo. And so over the years, a lot of different things that have happened, but they basically boil down to this. The countries that surround Congo, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, especially, but also others, Angola, different countries, Zimbabwe, which doesn't border on them, is close. Different countries have at different times intervened to support different actors on the ground in Congo who they felt could help secure their access to the mineral resources of Congo, which means that on the ground in DRC, a number of armed groups emerged backed by these various states to attempt to seize different territory, to be able to get hold of this sort of, most fundamental, the first step in this massive supply chain for these minerals, which are only becoming bigger because a lot of them are used in electric vehicles. But also on the same token, you've had groups of villagers based on ethnicity, based on area, based on different things that have also formed their own armed groups to fight back against these other armed groups that are mainly being backed by the neighboring countries. And then you have the various governments of Congo who at different times have been allied with different elements. So in the eastern part of DRC especially, which is where the most mineral-rich land is, you've got all these different groups that are fighting in different pieces like that. And about a year ago, this sort of stasis or equilibrium that was sort of introduced after the last election in 2018 broke down when M23, which is backed by Rwanda, launched a big operation into the Congo, and that's destabilized things. They've seized a lot of territory. countries from all over East Africa, the United Nations are in there claiming to be peacekeepers. But basically that's what we're seeing is another flare up in this attempt by various actors to control territory in the Congo in order to put themselves in the pole position to have at least some role in exploiting this $24 trillion worth of resources.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for that important context. And I know that we've discussed before the African Union, and I'm curious because it seems like a potential step would be to say, okay, well, how could this potentially benefit a lot of the African continent as opposed to, it getting extracted and then, as imperialism does, taken to Europe and the United States. What is the African Union stance on this, or what are their actions right now?
That's a really important question. I would say the African Union is basically split, and it's split on the basis of the two most relevant regional blocks of which DRC is a part. One, and the principal one in this situation, is the East African Community, of which Kenya really is the leading country, but Uganda, other East African countries are involved. And then the other, which there is, somewhat opposed to each other, is what's known as SADC, the Southern African Development Community, which is all the countries basically south of DRC in Southern Africa, South Africa, Angola, Tanzania, Mozambique. And both of those entities have different views basically on how the conflict should be resolved, and they have their own relationships with the government of DRC about that issue exactly. So the AU is split in a major way. Now, the East African Community Forces, which have been there's a few thousand of them, they're allegedly keeping the peace. Most people in DRC are very opposed to those forces being there because they think they're not there to keep the peace. They're actually just there to do what I said, to carve up the country. This is the big phrase in DRC, is the balkanization of DRC. And the Congolese government has now asked them to leave, along with the United Nations force, which many people also felt in Congo was playing the same role. So they've actually been asked to leave the country. Now, SADC has a longer history here. They are very supportive of the government. The president of Congo is a guy named Felix Tshisekedi. They've been supportive of the last couple governments, and they personally view both what's happening with the East African community and the general situation as bad for Congo if the country breaks apart. So they've tended to come in to back whoever the central government is, to try to back their play to have total control over the Congo. So you've got all these powerful African countries that have different views about how the thing should be resolved, but they all have a similar discourse. And I'm glad you brought up the issue of African unity, because they all do this in the basis of African unity. The Congolese government says we're doing this because we want to unite our country, keep it from being broken apart, and by making it a stronger country, we can normalize the relationships, especially with foreign actors, in order to get more money from mineral resources. SADC says, yes, same thing. This is why we need to keep the country together. The East African Community countries say, well, we all border the Congo. All the minerals that are coming out of there are mainly coming through our countries to go to overall ports. The economies are deeply intertwined with one another. So basically, Eastern Congo should be kind of a free zone that is basically managed by us and by our militaries, because that will advance Pan-African unity. So you have all these people who are trying to use the framework and the phraseology of Pan-African unity to hide the fact that what they're really trying to do is determine who's going to be the top dog in terms of moving out these mineral resources, and who's going to be the interlocutor with the major international companies and also the major international powers in order to do that. And unfortunately, because of that, the sort of African governing mechanism, this idea of the AU of African solutions to African problems, silencing the guns in Africa, these are two prominent AU initiatives to try to resolve all the problems that exist in Africa, have basically become null and void because there's such a disagreement between powerful African countries about how to address this issue. And none of those really are addressing the civil society of the DRC, which has been rising up. And in the eastern part of the DRC, there's military rule. So it's, 100 people about 2 months ago were massacred protesting the UN presence, but people have still they've been striking. There's a lot of strikes because it doesn't require you to come out on the street. People just shut down the economy. And what you're hearing from the street, from the people who are the most affected, is that they do want to see a lot of these foreign forces leave. And they do feel that Congo should control its own territory, should have one military, and it should do that. But they're also raising a lot of issues about the Congolese government and saying that the military also, though, acts in a way that reinforces the negative aspects of the pit mining, the terrible conditions for workers, the poverty wages that are being paid. And so there needs to be a much greater focus on development. And a lot of that is being left out because civil society as non-state actors are not being brought to the table. They are to some degree, but they're not really being brought to the table in a real way.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that because not too long ago, I spoke with Dr. Lagoke about what's happening in Western Africa, and this collective casting off of imperialist power. And I was wondering, how much do you feel folks on the ground in Congo are looking to that and using similar tactics? And also, how does that play into, I mean, Congo as it stands right now, as you said, is a huge nation, and it's a nation that has been carved by European powers, just like we see Africa was carved in the late 1800s by European powers. And there were no African nations that were actually invited to this table. So how much of this is also a question of like, well, is keeping it together really a perpetuation of imperialism in these, keeping those lines? How do people feel about that and the kind of collective, it seems like the African spread of casting off imperialist powers in general?
I think it's an interesting question and a complex one. And I think what we see, to speak to the first question, in DRC, really on all sides, you see a lot of support for what's happening in the Sahel, happening in West Africa. Obviously, French is the lingua franca, of the DRC, because Belgium, of course, was the colonial power. So even though they're not in the CFA Franc zone or anything like that, I think people still feel a lot of kinship with what's happening in West Africa. And they can see and feel that this is, it's contradictory, but in many ways, at least a step forward of Africans finally starting to say, we're going to reject the tutelage of the West, and we're going to make our own decisions. Now, whether or not that works out, we'll have to see how it all plays out. Whether or not, what is motivating different people, is it pure? Is it opportunistic? All of that's going to work itself out. But at the very least, it's saying like, okay, at this stage in the game, we're not going to just be told who our partners are. We're not going to be told what rules we should have around mining. And I think you can see a similar groundswell inside of DRC, which is honestly exactly why you see President Tshisekedi making a big play now. It's not fully cosmetic, but I would say it's mainly cosmetic, of actually addressing exactly this issue and saying, we're trying to bring in more mineral wealth. We're trying to, rewrite the agreements with these different companies, because I think he feels like most African leaders that what's happened in the Sahel could easily happen to him if you're not able to deliver some basic resources. And I think most Africans in DRC, and really everywhere I've been, Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Africa, Ghana, you pretty much hear the same thing. I think everyone has a pretty good sense that there is no way to lift African countries out of poverty without greater African unity. I mean, there's so many different issues to it. I mean, first and foremost, the ethnic issues that underpin so many of these conflicts, including Eastern DRC, which has a lot of hangover from what happened in Rwanda in the mid-1990s. When you have people from the same ethnic group, and this is all over Africa, living on two sides of, basically made up borders. You have differences between pastoralists, between farmers. A lot of the problems just can't be resolved in a strictly national context. So I think people see it on that sense. And then, the different African countries are endowed with so many different resources. It's obviously a continent that has huge human resources, the youngest continent on Earth, 70% of people under the age of 35, or maybe even 30. It's unbelievable, really, how young the continent is. So huge human resources that people have to work together. But I think, and this has been sort of the perennial question in a way of, the Pan-African movement since the formation of the OAU in 1963, is how do you get there? And I think many people, or what happens in a lot of times is you'll have in one situation, predatory powers from the outside try to exploit an issue. So the people themselves want to assert the sovereignty of their nation in order to push back those predatory powers, but they actually want greater links with the peoples of those places. And so I think really the question that is arising now is how to start from a commercial economic perspective to open up the boundaries, to get rid of the tariffs and the different taxes and the different things like that, to at least make the trade and the intercourse between peoples a little bit easier, to try to create an underpinning. And I think you see this if you look at a place like Goma, places like that. A huge amount of trade is happening with Rwanda. So even though DRC and Rwanda are constantly at odds, even though they're funding M23, you can find a Congolese who is against M23, is angry at Rwanda for funding them, but is still going to try to go across the border to trade with, the people who are over there in Rwanda. So how can those people-to-people ties be strengthened? I think is the big question of Pan-African unity, because the sort of nation-to-nation struggle is so variegated based on who's ruling which nation, and like, do they have a Pan-African vision, or are they just promoting a reactionary reality? And sometimes that flips back and forth in the same country over a short period of time. So I think the question a lot of people are asking is, how do social movements, trade unions, trade associations, commercial transactions, how do we strengthen that in a much bigger, in a much more solid way, because that's really the underpinning to a greater political conversation about African unity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also curious with regards, you saying that they'd go over the border to trade and that sort of perspective, because we see now that the US empire is in decline and BRICS is on the up, the rise of a multipolar world. And so how much does that play into moves and organizing that you see happening in places like Congo with regards to casting off imperialism, and then also still wanting to trade and work with entities like Russia and China, and of course, potentially Europe as well, without engaging in the classic imperialist relationship?
Yeah, well, this is a huge issue in DRC. And, it's become a big issue because China obviously is arguably the world's largest economy, second largest economy. And it's, one of the major players in mining. And most of the minerals that are leaving out of there are leaving from Chinese companies. Now, the way the economy works, a lot of this stuff is ending up in Apple phones and things like that. So it's not strictly that. But, the West has become very afraid of China's role in DRC, and also Russia, which has been a big undercurrent recently because there is a faction inside the government of DRC that very much wants to work with Russia around security issues, and that has freaked them out. So if people can remember when Blinken went to DRC and how they've announced this thing at the Africa Summit of some DRC, Zambia, US cobalt mining deal or whatever, it's, very loose and very vague, but they have started some big company backed by, I think, Bill Gates to, mine to whatever. A lot of that is because they're very concerned about losing their sort of pole position in terms of the sort of first step of minerals they view as critical for a green economy in the 21st century. So this is becoming a much bigger issue. I think, in DRC, it's interesting. I mean, there's a discourse that has been raised, a lot of it coming from the government with a lot of criticism of China and the way that they've done things. But there's another discourse that's competing with that, that's saying that the criticism of China is really the government trying to cover up for their own mistakes and not being able to actually capitalize on these deals in the correct way. I think there's probably a little bit of truth to both things. I mean, I think a lot of these Chinese companies are acting unscrupulously, quite frankly, but I do think that the government totally controls the environment around these companies. And, the military and oftentimes is like the enforcer of the economic, realities of these areas with these terrible photos people have seen of people mining in these pits and all of that. So if they wanted to address some of this, they could. But the reality is the government leaders, the military leaders are getting a pretty penny by, collaborating as a part of the process. So the real conversation I think we're seeing now is sort of twofold. On the one hand, I think there is a strong conversation inside of Congo amongst, the activists who are most concerned about these issues, especially mining issues, of how do you establish a greater sovereign infrastructure inside of DRC with clearer mining rules, clearer worker rights, and clearer rules about, how much money is going to be extracted by foreign companies versus the Congo. And I think that is an ongoing conversation and an important one, and one that's happening all over the continent. It's happening in Zimbabwe, it's happening in Ethiopia. There's a lot of moves around how you can create more cooperative-based miners so that these smaller artisan miners can pool their resources, actually buy the, actual equipment, put themselves in a position where they can make real deals with like real actors and assert their own rights and pieces like that. So we're seeing, that activity happening as well, which is overlaid on the geopolitical space, because realistically, the thing you see about China is, in many ways, China needs Africa as much as Africa needs China. And I think that's the part of the story that a lot of people don't talk about. So when the discourse was coming out from the government of DRC that China is exploiting DRC and they need to do more, that China just started saying, okay, yes, we will do more. They invited Tshisekedi there. They start re-signing deals. They're pledging more money for hospitals, for roads, for different things like that, the opposite of what the US would ever do. And so I think there is a subset of people in DRC and really the whole continent who feel like if we could get better control of our own resources, we can definitely deal with China, and we can make a deal with them that will be better for us than the other deals, which means that we can play them off against every other player, which means we can improve the broader environment and get the most out of our mineral resources. And that is the thing that the US is terrified with in Congo, because before they've had pretty much a total free run. They have a lot of control over the government of Congo. Tshisekedi actually canceled his appearance at the Russia-Africa Summit this year at the last second. Most people say because he was trying to make sure the US didn't think that he was moving into like a quote unquote Russian camp and wanted to show he was open to them and that he loves the West, blah, 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 so on and so forth. Very close ties to China, very close ties to Belgium. And so they've pretty much for years until, the early to mid 2000s had total control of the economy of Congo. It's kind of gotten away from them. It doesn't seem like they were really fully paying attention to it for a while. And now I think they realize, oh, wait a second. If Congo gets itself together politically and they start aligning with China, then they're going to have a stranglehold on our mineral resources. And if then they consider them their mineral resources, even though they're Congolese. And if they start working with Russia, then we won't have the military control over them. And that means it's a wild card. And that means our companies will have to basically deal with these angry Africans who want their money, the Chinese who are trying to get their money, and we're not going to be able to necessarily stop them militarily, and that could be a disaster. So it's all unfolding in a lot of different ways. If you follow the like diplomatic intrigue of Kinshasa, the capital, there's a lot of intrigue going on right now in DRC and lots of rumors. UAE, also a big player there. UAE, of course, is the largest purveyor of gold on earth, the biggest gold markets. And so ultimately, there's a lot of different changing of hands and backroom deals and different pieces going on. But I think when you go to the average Congolese, especially in the mineral resources area, the main thing they want is no matter who is there doing the mining, for them to follow by some serious rules, including environmental rules, because the using of mercury, which is major for mining and other things, has massively poisoned many of these areas as well. So from an environmental level, from a workers' rights level, I think that's what you're hearing from sort of the masses of people, is a need to actually address these issues so that they can make a livelihood and not die at 32 of being crushed in a mine or having cancer from mercury.
Yeah, and of course, as I've read, a lot of the people mining, just like they were in this country, are children, and so this is a further need to incorporate the workers' rights and basic human rights, really. And I'm curious. I mean, you were talking about M23 and how they're backed by Rwanda. And of course, the way my brain works, and I'm like, Rwanda and the US? Like, I can't help but that being the next question. So like, how many of these militias or military groups that are all clashing, how many of them are backed by, either by proxy or directly a Western power that's vying for that space?
I would say a good number of them. I mean, certainly the M23 and the groups that are backed by Rwanda. I think you could make a similar case. I mean, Uganda is playing a big role. It's different than Rwanda because Uganda has an agreement with the government of DRC to wage a joint war against two groups, one ADF that claims to be tied to ISIS and another one, Codeco, that claims a lot of things, but is really mainly known for being really, really brutal. And so that is not seen as like negatively in a lot of the international context because it's like technically legal. But I think when you look at groups that are aligning with them, Uganda, whatever its pretensions to be, non-aligned, tends to align much more with the West and to be more in the Western camp. And I think Rwanda 100% is in the Western camp, always has been since the rise of the RPF, Rwandan Patriotic Front governments. It's one of these things that if you ask them, the RPF cadres, they will swear up and down they're not tied to the West. But at the end of the day, when you really look at the realities of it, they have been instrumentalized as a major force for Western powers and kind of seen, and some people actually call Rwanda the Israel of Africa, because they've kind of been seen as a very reliable pro-Western state that can help, keep the things in that region within a realm that the West is comfortable with. Now, there are some differences between the West and Rwanda over this. And it's unclear how deep they are. The US and France have been, well, really more the US, less France, have been very critical of Rwanda and saying you have to stop this, you shouldn't be backing M23. But on the same token, they're still working with Rwanda in a range of different areas. So depending on who you ask, it's maybe kind of like a small disagreement. Others are saying that it's more a more serious breach. There's more criticism of the West coming out of Rwanda in the past year or so because of this criticism. And so, where that's going, I don't know exactly. Obviously, the West really wants to keep Shikedi in their column against China and against Russia. So they're willing to verbally be very critical of Rwanda. But, financially, for instance, they're also playing a role in backing Rwanda as the new kind of security contractor all across Africa. It's the French who are paying for the Rwandans to be in Mozambique, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting reality there. But I do think that we can see that the West in many ways is kind of backing both sides against the middle, because on the one hand, they're for Rwanda. They also have a good relationship with Kenya. They've said they're in favor of the EAC force that Kenya has put forward that Congolese people hate. They're saying they're also for Tshisekedi. So I think in many ways, the US is really trying to be over top of the board and move all the pieces. And I think France is the same way. It's, typical really of imperialism, especially French imperialism. Whoever is the opposition of the day is living in Paris. Then they go back to the country and they switch places with the other people. And I think this is very much that kind of situation where they're looking, okay, how do we maneuver all these different pieces, kind of play one side off against each other to make sure at the end of the day, we still have control. And there are some who believe that really the Western powers think they benefit the most from chaos, from not having strong states. And they prefer to have Rwanda, DRC, Burundi, Uganda, always fighting both each other and also fighting internally these various armed groups and insurgencies and so on and so forth, because the minerals keep flowing no matter what. And so without any strong states, all the minerals are flowing out, the money is still being made, but there's no one who can make any strong, legitimate claim on that the rights to that mineral wealth that could potentially upend and change the reality for the multinational corporations.
So kind of wrapping up here, I know nobody has a crystal ball, but I always try to think of not only what we can do as people who live in the US, but also what we should be looking for, because as you mentioned, Tshisekedi is trying to make sure that he appeases the West, but also is looking at the, the Sahel and being like, I don't want that to happen to me. So what do you feel that there is hope that he might just be like the leader that folks in Congo are looking for? And if so, does that place him, as so many in Africa have experienced before, with a giant target on his head because he's not willing to play the Western imperialists' game?
I think sadly it's unlikely. His partisans, I'm sure, would be upset that I said that, but but they're trying to make a comparison. But I don't think so. And I think that there's elections that are coming up, maybe in December of this year, could get pushed into 2024. And you can already see that, Tshisekedi, first and foremost, kind of came into, it doesn't really seem like he won the election. Let me put it to you like that. Almost everyone else thinks another person who's now running again won the election. But nonetheless, through various politics, he was able to get in there. And I think many people feel that, he more or less is just another one of the leaders of Congo who can talk a great game. I mean, Mobutu could talk a great game, but who really at the end of the day is more concerned with the traditional desires of the Congolese elite, which is to just, skim the cream off the top. I think Tshisekedi is a little bit better than that in my imagination. I think that he has some pretensions to do a little bit more, but that's only because it's impossible to not do a little bit more and stay in power from my point of view, given what we've seen in the Sahel. But I think we're getting ready, sadly, probably to enter into another period of political turmoil around this issue of the elections, where I don't think any of the players who are really involved seem to have the same type of social vision as what's coming, from say Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso, or if we look back to even the history of someone like Patrice Lumumba, we're not really seeing that kind of discourse. We're seeing vaguely developmentalist discourse, still generally being tied to the West, a desire, it seems, not to make bold moves to really sort of break with the status quo, and ultimately kind of a floundering and slight balkanization, or sort of adhering to this balkanization of the country, which is worse. So I think in some ways, if you look at Tshisekedi's policies, it does represent in many ways the fact that the Congolese street, if you will, is having some success, and that no one thinks they can be president without talking about roads, schools, hospitals, and to be seen to be building some of them, to be renegotiating mining deals and so on and so forth. But beyond sort of those kind of most basic moves in that direction, it doesn't really seem as substantive as it potentially could be. And I think we'll, continue to see that. So I always hope to be surprised, but I suspect that, the DRC is going to be sadly another round of political turmoil until someone really emerges who can unite the people around an agenda to really radically change. And I don't know if that's going to come from anyone in the traditional political class. Tshisekedi comes from the political class, Jean-Pierre Bemba, who now is working with him, Martin Fayulu, all the people they're all contending with one another, but they all basically come from the same place, which is either the elite under Mobutu or the elite who are in the opposition living in Europe, some of which started working with Mobutu in the 90s. And I think we need a cleaner break from that reality. And there's a lot of other players and forces that are going to be there too as well. So it's going to be an important country to watch, an important issue to watch. I think what happens in the December election is going to be vastly consequential for the African continent.
Yeah, and so as you were talking, I just thought of one more thing that to take us out here, which is, of course, I mean, I'm talking to you on an instrument that requires those rare earth minerals, right? Like we in the West grow up with basically using the wealth of Africa in order to do our work and our play and everything else. And I'm curious if you could talk briefly about why that's important to make those connections, because, you know, as I like to say, imperialism is also a home game. Why is it important to, you know, to take notice of what's going on in DRC and how that links to our struggles here at home with regards to workers' rights or the environment or anything else?
No, I think that's a great question. And I think it speaks to the fundamental dishonesty of many of these big corporate giants in the West about what they're doing. I mean, every company that's getting cobalt, nickel, or whatever out of DRC, they're all linked up to these organizations that are like, you know, securing minerals, you know, with human rights. All of that is totally, I mean, I don't really know what to say. It's totally fake. And so you have, you know, Apple, Ford, General Motors, you know, Nokia, whoever, you know, anyone who's using any of these batteries or anything like that, especially batteries when we're talking about DRC, that essentially you are directly tied into the exploitation of Congolese workers, but you're also directly tied into your exploitation as a worker by the same companies. I mean, you look at what's happening with the auto workers, you look at the average person working at an Apple store. I mean, those people are not being helped by the huge trillions and billions of dollars that are being generated by these corporations and heavily on the backs of these African workers. So I think it's a question of who really controls the wealth of our society, who really controls the resources, and that's the real connection. Like, should the people in DRC get the vast majority of wealth from anything that's taken out of their country? Absolutely. Should the workers who put together the parts for all these things that we buy get the vast majority of wealth that's created from the sale of those products? And so it's, you know, part of the same supply chain, but asking really the same question. And I think when you start to look at the interest of, you know, poor and working class people, then the interests start to align to a much greater degree, because we don't really have an interest in making Tim Cook any richer. So it's really no skin off of our back if more of the wealth is going to people in Congo, as it doesn't hurt them if more of the wealth is going to the workers at the Apple store. And perhaps if we were thinking more about the workers in Congo and the workers at the Apple store, we could be able to have some sort of equitable trade relationship. Because when you talk to people in DRC who are in this area, they don't want mining to stop per se. Although, you know, there are many people who would like to do other things, and that's why they want education, more access to resources. They just want, if there's going to be trade, for it to actually be fair and to benefit them. So it's a win-win proposition. But we can't have a win-win proposition when, you know, we're actually talking about these big bosses of these big corporations rather than the relations between, you know, working class people between the two different countries.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eugene. That is a brilliant way to wrap it up. Really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and to give us so much important information about what's going on in DRC. Appreciate it.
Right on. Thanks for having me.